With King Charles managing his health and a genuinely small pool of senior royals left to shoulder official duties, one figure keeps getting called on above almost anyone else in the family: Princess Anne. In mid-July, the 75-year-old Princess Royal, alongside her husband Vice Admiral Sir Tim Lawrence, touched down in South Korea to begin a 5-day diplomatic tour across Asia, and the trip offers a pretty clear window into why she remains the monarchy's most reliable workhorse. Welcome viewers to my channel. Please subscribe, like my video and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. Body language expert Darren Stanton, speaking on behalf of Betfair Casino, weighed in on why Anne was the natural choice for this particular assignment. In his view, sending Anne signals a deep level of confidence from the king, and the fact that she and Sir Tim were the ones chosen for the trip says something in itself about where that trust sits within the family. To understand why this particular trip fell to Anne, it helps to step back and look at the state of the working monarchy in 2026. With Charles managing ongoing cancer treatment, Kate having spent much of 2024 focused on her own recovery, and William increasingly tied to domestic duties and preparing for his future role, the list of royals available for demanding, multi-country overseas tours has shrunk considerably. Anne has spent decades building a reputation as the family member who simply shows up, year after year, for exactly this kind of engagement, regardless of distance, weather, or how physically demanding the schedule turns out to be. This wasn't Anne's first trip to South Korea either. Her last visit to the country came roughly 8 years earlier, when she attended the 2018 Winter Olympics, a reflection of her long-standing role representing Britain at the Olympic and international sporting level, tied to her decades on the International Olympic Committee. The tour's centerpiece was built around commemoration. Anne and Sir Tim traveled to Busan to mark the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Imjin River, one of the most significant engagements involving British forces during the Korean War, alongside related commemorations tied to the Battle of Gapyeong. At the United Nations Memorial Cemetery, Anne took part in a formal wreath-laying ceremony, observing a UN flag-raising service alongside veterans and dignitaries. In a quieter, more personal moment during the visit, she placed a single white chrysanthemum on the grave of a British soldier who had been killed at just 19 years old, on the very same calendar date as her visit decades later. She was welcomed to the ceremony by Busan's mayor and spent time meeting with Korean War veterans present for the occasion. Stanton pointed to this stretch of the tour as a clear demonstration of the deep respect Anne commands from the people she meets abroad. He described the reactions from those greeting her as gestures of genuine warmth rather than nervous formality, arguing that the difference between polite deference and real affection tends to show up in small, hard-to-fake details, like the kind of broad, natural smiles people give when they're actually pleased to be somewhere rather than just going through the motions. From the solemnity of Busan, the tour shifted registers entirely. Anne and Sir Tim traveled to Ulsan to visit HD Hyundai Heavy Industries, one of the largest shipbuilding operations anywhere in the world. It's the kind of engagement that reflects a less discussed but consistent thread running through Anne's public work: her long involvement with maritime industry, trade relationships, and the practical, industrial side of Britain's international partnerships, categories of engagement that rarely generate headlines the way ceremonial appearances do, but that make up a substantial share of what she actually spends her time on. That same day, the tour moved into more overtly diplomatic territory. Anne met with South Korean President Lee Jae-myung at his residence, with photographs from the meeting capturing an evidently relaxed, warm exchange between the two. From there, she and Sir Tim attended a reception at the British Embassy in Seoul, celebrating the broader UK Republic of Korea partnership. The Seoul leg of the trip broadened the tour's focus even further, touching on cultural and educational ties between the two countries. Anne took part in an event connected to UK-Korea Sustainable Fashion Futures, a program highlighting collaboration between the British and Korean fashion and textile industries, and visited Korea University as part of the tour's educational component. She also met with representatives from Save the Children, a charity she has personally supported since 1970, a connection that stretches back more than half a century and reflects one of the longest-running patronages of her public life. At the embassy reception celebrating the UK-Korea partnership, Anne met members of NMIX, a K-pop group, adding a distinctly modern, pop culture note to a tour otherwise built around historical commemoration and formal diplomacy. Stanton noted that throughout these more social engagements, the people meeting Anne consistently appeared delighted to be in her company, and that her own body language throughout the trip suggested someone who was confident, comfortable, and genuinely enjoying the experience rather than simply enduring a packed diplomatic schedule. None of this is really out of character for Anne. A glance at her overseas travel over just the past 2 years shows a schedule most working professionals half her age would find exhausting: commemorations in Sri Lanka and Namibia, a shipping conference in Dubai, ceremonial appearances in Norway and Normandy marking wartime anniversaries, the Paris Olympics, memorial events in the Netherlands and France, a Cape Town memorial opening, the Six Nations in Paris, an International Olympic Committee session in Greece, Gallipoli centenary commemorations in Turkey, and parades in Guernsey and Sark, among many others. That relentless pace hasn't come without cost. In June 2024, Anne was hospitalized for 5 days after a concussion and other minor injuries sustained in an incident at Gatcombe Park, her family's estate, with injuries consistent with having been struck by a horse. Less than a year later, Sir Tim himself had to pull out of a planned trip to South Africa at the last minute after sustaining a suspected torn ligament while working on the same estate, leaving Anne to complete that particular tour solo. Even setbacks like these haven't meaningfully slowed her schedule, a pattern that's become something of a hallmark of how she approaches royal duty generally. From South Korea, the tour continued directly into a second leg. Anne and Sir Tim traveled on to Thailand for a 2-day visit, with an itinerary that included a visit to a school in Bangkok supported by Save the Children Thailand, continuing the charity connection that ran through the Korean leg of the trip. The Thai program also included a meeting with Thailand's Prime Minister and an audience with the Thai King and Queen, rounding out a tour that, across its full length, touched on war commemoration, industry, education, charity, diplomacy, and popular culture across 2 countries in the span of a single week. Stepping back, tours like this one reveal something about how the working monarchy actually functions behind the more visible headlines about Charles's health or William's expanding responsibilities. Overseas diplomatic representation doesn't stop just because the pool of available royals has narrowed. It shifts toward whoever has both the stamina and the institutional trust to carry it out reliably, and for the better part of 5 decades, that description has fit Anne about as well as anyone in the family's modern history. There's also something notable in how consistently this kind of coverage frames Anne, not as a headline-grabbing figure in the way some younger royals have become, but as the family's steady, unglamorous engine, the one who turns up for the shipyard visit and the war memorial with the same evident commitment as she does for the more photogenic moments with K-pop stars or Olympic athletes. It's a reputation built entirely on consistency rather than spectacle, and it's arguably why she keeps getting sent on exactly these kinds of trips when the family's bench of available representatives is thinner than it's been in years. At 75, with a husband recovering from his own injuries and a work schedule that would challenge royals decades younger, Princess Anne closed out this particular tour having represented Britain at a war memorial, a shipyard, a university, a fashion showcase, and a K-pop reception, all within the space of about a week, before immediately moving on to a second country. It's a pace that says a great deal about both her personal work ethic and the position she now occupies within a monarchy that has fewer senior figures than ever to call on. Whether it's Seoul, Bangkok, or wherever the next assignment takes her, the pattern by now is unmistakable. When the family needs someone dependable on short notice, Anne is very often the one who goes. If you enjoyed this look at the Princess Royal's tireless work behind the scenes of the monarchy, let us know your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more coverage of the royals who keep the institution running. It's worth pausing on that Save the Children relationship a little longer, because half a century of continuous involvement with a single charity is genuinely unusual, even by royal standards. Anne became president of the organization in 1970, when she was barely 20 years old, and has remained connected to it in various capacities ever since. Over the decades, that relationship has taken her to some of the more difficult, less glamorous corners of humanitarian work, refugee camps, disaster zones, and areas of conflict that don't typically make for cheerful royal photo opportunities. Meeting Save the Children representatives in Seoul wasn't a one-off gesture tacked onto a diplomatic tour. It was a continuation of one of the longest-running threads of her entire public life, and by most accounts, one of the causes she personally cares about most, rather than one assigned to her simply because a royal needed to be attached to it. That distinction matters when trying to understand what actually drives Anne's approach to royal duty. Where some public engagements are clearly a matter of institutional obligation, showing up because the family needs representation, others reflect a genuine, decades-long personal investment. The Korea trip managed to touch both categories in a single week: solemn commemorative duty in Busan, industrial diplomacy in Ulsan, and personal cause work in Seoul, all handled with what observers on the ground described as the same steady, unflappable energy throughout. The Korean War commemorations at the heart of this tour deserve a bit more context too, because it's a conflict that doesn't get nearly as much attention in British popular memory as the two world wars, despite the scale of British involvement. Between 1950 and 1953, British and Commonwealth forces fought as part of the United Nations coalition defending South Korea, and the Battle of Imjin River in particular became one of the most costly and significant engagements British troops faced during the entire conflict. Thousands of British service members were killed or wounded during the broader war, and the United Nations Memorial Cemetery in Busan remains the only UN cemetery of its kind anywhere in the world, the resting place for many of the Commonwealth soldiers who never returned home. For a 75th anniversary commemoration like this one, having a senior royal present carries real symbolic weight, both for the aging population of surviving veterans and for South Korea itself, a country that has, over the decades, made a point of publicly honoring the international forces who fought to defend it. Anne's willingness to personally place a flower on an individual soldier's grave, rather than limiting her involvement to the larger ceremonial wreath-laying, is the kind of small gesture that tends to resonate more with veterans' families than the more formal elements of a state visit ever could. None of what happened in Korea is really surprising to anyone who has followed Anne's public life closely. For years running, she has consistently ranked among the most active working members of the royal family by sheer number of annual engagements, frequently topping internal palace tallies that track how many official duties each family member carries out over the course of a year. That statistic has become something of a running theme in royal reporting. While younger, more photographed royals often dominate headlines, it's frequently Anne quietly racking up the highest engagement count, year after year, with comparatively little fanfare. Part of what makes that consistency possible is Anne's famously unglamorous, practical approach to the job itself. She's spoken in the past about viewing royal duty essentially as a form of service and employment rather than a lifestyle to be enjoyed for its own sake, an attitude that seems to explain both her willingness to take on demanding, less high-profile assignments like a Korean shipyard tour, and her relative indifference to the kind of media attention that follows some other family members. She isn't chasing headlines. She's working through a schedule, and by most accounts, has approached it that way for decades. There's also a quieter structural story behind why this particular trip landed on Anne's calendar rather than someone else's. As the monarchy's working roster has thinned, due to Charles's treatment schedule, Kate's own recovery period, and William's increasingly domestic focus as he prepares for an eventual future reign, the family has leaned more heavily on its most experienced, most reliably available members to fill the gap left by international engagements that still need a royal presence. Anne, alongside the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, has increasingly become one of the family's default choices for exactly this kind of demanding overseas representation. That dynamic isn't necessarily a sign of institutional strain. Royal families have always distributed engagements based on who's available and suited to a given trip, but it does underline just how much weight currently rests on a smaller circle of working royals than the monarchy has had to rely on in recent memory. A 5-day, two-country tour spanning war commemoration, industrial diplomacy, and charity work is a genuinely demanding assignment for anyone, let alone someone well into their 70s, and the fact that Anne took it on without apparent hesitation says as much about the current shape of the working monarchy as it does about her personally. The Thailand leg, while shorter, followed a similar pattern of substance over spectacle. Beyond the school visit for Save the Children Thailand, the itinerary included formal diplomatic engagements with the country's prime minister and an audience with Thailand's king and queen, the kind of state-level meetings that reinforce Britain's broader diplomatic relationships across Southeast Asia rather than generating a single standout headline moment. Coming directly on the heels of the Korean leg, it meant Anne and Sir Tim closed out their trip having represented the crown across two very different Asian nations, touching everything from Cold War-era military history to contemporary charitable partnerships, within the span of about a week. Taken as a whole, this tour is a fairly complete portrait of what Anne has quietly represented within the royal family for more than 50 years: reliability over recognition, substance over spectacle, and a work ethic that shows up in shipyards and school visits as readily as it does at Olympic ceremonies or war memorials. At a moment when the monarchy has genuinely fewer senior figures available to carry that kind of load, her role has only become more central, even if it rarely generates the same kind of coverage as the family members whose lives play out more visibly in the tabloids. Whether the next assignment takes her to Asia, Africa, or somewhere closer to home, the pattern by now is well established, and it's likely to remain one of the more dependable constants of the modern working monarchy for as long as she's willing and able to keep up the pace. If you enjoyed this deeper look at the Princess Royal's work behind the scenes, let us know your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more coverage of the royals who keep